right. I feel like now is a good time to start.
Okay.
Yeah, and if anybody comes in late, they will just join us where they join us. So first I'll just take a second to introduce myself so you know why I'm here. My name is Cara Phoenix. I just started at MCLA this year and run the Gender and Sexuality Center. So I would like to say that I kind of do everything LGBTQ and feminist here on campus. Hence our wonderful exhibit. I feel very lucky to have been approached by the Frances Perkins Center to house their beautiful exhibit here on campus. And obviously also thanks to Kate for helping us get that here in the library. We are joined tonight by Emma Wigner, the program director of the Frances Perkins Center. She joined the Frances Perkins Center as the program and education director in 2022. She has a bachelor's degree in art history from Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania and holds a master's degree in the history of decorative arts from Bard Graduate Center in New York City. Before moving to Maine, where the Frances Perkins Center is, Wigner worked in public programs in the education department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in the education office of the Cloisters, and in the Metz Branch Museum dedicated to medieval art. She has planned and implemented many kinds of public programs over her 17 years at the Met and is really excited to share the story of now Frances Perkins and her family with visitors to the Perkins homestead, which is in Newcastle, and in the exhibition center I should have figured out how to say this word. Damariscotta? Did I say that right?
Yes, local state, Damariscotta.
Damariscotta. So then, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Emma to tell us all about Frances Perkins. But if you have any questions and you're online, feel free to pop them in the chat. And if you're here in person, feel free to jot them down on a piece of paper. And our students will be collecting those whether you're virtually or here in person. That way we don't lose our thoughts with the questions. All right, Emma, thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to MCLA for inviting us to present our traveling exhibit that you can see in the back of the room that those of you who are there in person can look at. And I also wanted to thank Kathy Friedberg, who is an MCLA alum and who is one of our greatest advocates for sharing the story of Frances Perkins in Massachusetts, and she's wonderful. So thank you, Kathy. And just a little bit about the Frances Perkins Center. It was founded in 2008 to make the exemplary work and career of Frances Perkins both better known to the American people by honoring and preserving the legacy of the woman behind the New Deal. And the center inspires people to address current economic and social problems as Perkins would through work in areas of education, outreach, and advocacy. And as Ara mentioned, the nonprofit, nonpartisan center is currently headquartered in Damariscotta, Maine, where it offers an interpretive exhibit on Perkins' life. And in January of 2020, the center acquired the place that Perkins called home, her family homestead on the Damariscotta River in Newcastle, Maine, which is the twin village to Damariscotta. This 57-acre property was announced as a National Historic Landmark on August 25th, 2014 by Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully I won't mess this up. We had it before. No. Oh. And there we go. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Let me just find my script again. 1 second. Frances Perkins was Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor and the first woman ever to serve in a presidential cabinet. Following the president's death, Perkins wrote a best-selling biography of FDR entitled The Roosevelt I Knew, re-released in 2011 in a Penguin edition. In his introduction to this edition, former New York Times editorial board member Adam Cohen writes, quote, "If American history textbooks accurately reflected the past, Frances Perkins would be recognized as one of the nation's greatest heroes, as iconic as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. Like Franklin, Perkins was a brilliant self-creation. There had not been anyone like her before, and there has not been anyone like her since. Like Paine, she helped to start a revolution." Frances Perkins is acknowledged as the woman behind the New Deal, the woman who created Social Security, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, 40-hour work week, limits on child labor, and the modern middle class. She was a deliberately self-made woman, and she rose to become America's leading advocate for industrial safety and workers' rights, and the first woman to serve as a cabinet secretary. Tonight, we'll delve into Ms. Perkins' biography and attempt to understand the formative circumstances and the unique depth of character that defined the trajectory of her exceptional life. She was born Fanny Coralie Perkins in Boston in 1880, but her roots were here, where I am, in Maine. Her mother, Susan E. Bean, came from Bethel, Maine, and her father, Frederick Perkins, was born and raised in Newcastle, on land along the Damariscotta River his ancestors first settled in the 1750s. The family farmed the land and also operated a brickyard at the river's edge, traces of which are still visible today. And this is sort of a back view of the Perkins homestead in Newcastle. And it's a photograph from the 1960s, but it looks very much like this today still. And you'll notice that the brick house in the foreground, or the background rather, is a house that was built with bricks that were made on the property down by the river. After the Civil War, economic times became more difficult in Maine, and the brickyard began to falter. Frederick and his younger brother, Augustus, moved to Massachusetts for better prospects, while the oldest son, Charles, remained in Newcastle to manage the farm. In 1882, Frederick Perkins moved his young family from Boston to Worcester, where he opened a successful stationery business. He maintained close ties to Newcastle, however, and Fanny, as she was known to the family, spent her childhood summers with her grandmother on the farm in Newcastle. Frequently in winters, her grandmother and uncle would stay with the Perkins family in Worcester. Cynthia Otis Perkins, then a widow in her 70s, was the center of the family, quote, "an extremely wise woman, worldly wise, as well as spiritually wise," Frances later explained. "I am extraordinarily the product of my grandmother," she said, whose wisdom guided her throughout her life. It was at the brick house, built in 1837 as a wedding gift for her grandparents, that Fanny heard stories about the French and Indian Wars, when the Perkins family maintained a garrison by the river to shelter the community in case of danger. She also learned of life before the Revolution and of her Otis family relatives who had played a major part in the colonists' fight for independence. The family was especially proud of their ancestor, James Otis, an attorney and revolutionary who famously railed against taxation without representation. He was clubbed in the head by a British officer and never fully recovered, a true martyr to the cause against tyranny. These stories were passed down by Cynthia's mother, Thankful Otis, who spent her last years in the house. Steeped in this family connection to the nation's turbulent beginnings, Fanny was to further experience a first-hand encounter with the potential risks of a political life. In the summer following her 15th birthday, her grandmother's cousin, Union General Oliver Otis Howard, founder of Howard University and first head of the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, visited the brick house. Because Howard had lost his right arm in the war, young Fanny was enlisted as his secretary. Although she found this task tedious at the time, she later vividly remembered the occasion and her famous relative. Howard was a controversial figure, accused of misappropriating funds, and was eventually hounded from office. But his family admired him and were proud of his life of public service. Fanny was raised with a deep appreciation of history and pride in her ancestry, and an awareness of what one person could achieve in serving others. She came of age understanding her heritage and adopting the Yankee values of frugality, ingenuity, tenacity, and self-reliance, as well as a belief that the new nation, only a century old at her birth, held opportunities for all who sought and were willing to work for them. Her life would take her far beyond the humble farm in Newcastle, but it is there that she returned year after year for rest and renewal. The Perkins household in Worcester was strict, conservative, and Republican. Fanny and her sister Ethel, 4 years her junior, were restricted largely to the people and events within their house and the nearby Plymouth Congregational Church. It was only when Fanny entered school that she encountered poverty. When she asked her parents why nice people could be poor, they gave her the accepted answers of the day, that poverty was the result of alcohol or laziness, and that little girls shouldn't concern themselves with such things. Frederick Perkins instead cultivated Fanny's budding intelligence. He taught her to read at an early age and encouraged her interest in classical literature. He gave her lessons in Greek grammar, starting when she was 8. She recalled that he read Greek for his personal enjoyment, and that he was also very knowledgeable about the law, a shared interest with his brother Augustus, who was an attorney. Although it was unusual for young women to attend college at that time, it was always assumed that Fanny would do so. She graduated from the college preparatory curriculum at Worcester's Classical High School, and then enrolled in Mount Holyoke College, 50 miles away in South Hadley, Massachusetts. Founded in 1837, Mount Holyoke is the nation's oldest continuing institution of higher education for women. Its founder, Mary Lyon, believed that women should be educated, but with education came responsibility. Quote, education was to fit one to do good. Go where no one else will go, do what no one else will do, she advised Mount Holyoke's young women. This sense of purpose clearly foretold the remarkable career that Fanny Perkins would eventually pursue. At Mount Holyoke, Fanny, known as Perk to her classmates, came under the demanding tutelage of professors who insisted she enroll in only the most rigorous courses. She majored in physics with minors in chemistry and biology. She was a popular student, becoming class president her senior year and permanent class president upon graduation. You'll see this photo shows her holding ivy pot on the occasion of her graduation. It was in her final semester, however, that she took a course in American economic history that would have the most profound impact on her life. Taught by historian Anna May Sewell, the course concerned the growth of industrialism in England and America. Professor Sewell required her students to visit the mills along the Connecticut River in neighboring Holyoke to observe working conditions there. Of this experience, Frances later said, "From the time I was in college, I was horrified at the work that many women and children had to do in factories. There were no effective laws that regulated the number of hours they were permitted to work. There were no provisions which guarded their health, nor adequately looked after their compensation in case of injury. Those things seemed very wrong. I was young and was inspired with the idea of reforming, or at least doing what I could to help change those abuses." Fanny's fellow students organized a chapter of the National Consumers League, and in February of 1902 invited its executive secretary, Florence Kelley, to speak at Mount Holyoke. Later, Frances Perkins told a friend that Kelley's speech, quote, first opened my mind to the necessity for and the possibility of the work which became my vocation. When Fanny Perkins graduated from Mount Holyoke in 1902, her parents intended that she live at home and take a teaching position, or perhaps find work with the church until a suitable marriage prospect appeared. Fanny had other ideas. When her efforts to seek employment in social work in New York were unsuccessful because of a lack of experience, and she later recalled that she looked like she was only 15 years old at the time, she began reading materials in the field, including How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis's 1890 depiction of life in New York's slums. This book would have a considerable impact on Fanny, and she frequently referred to its influence on her early career development in later years. Ultimately, she left Worcester for a teaching position at Ferry Hall, an elite school for girls in Lake Forest, Illinois. Further demonstrating her independence, she changed her name from the cute and childish sounding Fanny to the more dignified and mature Frances. In June of 1905, she also changed her religious affiliation from the Congregational Church of her family when she was confirmed in the Episcopal Church. This deliberate choice of faith reflected a deep spirituality that both sustained and focused Perkins throughout her life, as well as being a guiding force in her career of public service. The Episcopal Church in the Chicago area also gave her access to a different and more privileged social sphere than the middle-class New England church of her childhood, and allowed her to forge new friendships and connections with both the powerful elite and those who shared her more philanthropic, progressive views. She was also drawn to the sense of ritual, ceremony, and discipline that she saw in the Episcopal Church. While in Chicago, Frances Perkins spent her free time and vacations working at Chicago Commons and Jane Addams Hull House, two of the oldest and most well-known settlement houses in the country. These institutions were designed to provide educational, recreational, and other social services to the urban poor. Believing that the poverty she witnessed was the result of unfair labor practices, particularly those targeting women and children, Frances became interested in the role that trade and labor unions could play in protecting workers from harm. As a result of this experience in working with the poor and the unemployed, she became convinced of her vocation. She later said, quote, I had to do something about unnecessary hazards to life, unnecessary poverty. It was sort of up to me. One thing seemed perfectly clear. Our Lord had directed all who were following in his path to visit the widows, the orphans, the fatherless, the prisoners, and so forth. Definitely the circumstances of the life of the people of my generation was my business, and I ought to do something about it. In 1907, Frances accepted a position as General Secretary of the Philadelphia Research and Protective Association, a new organization started by Hull House alumna Frances Keller, who you see here. The association's goal was to thwart the diversion of newly arrived and vulnerable girls to the city, including immigrants and Black women from the South, into prostitution. Frances helped expose so-called employment agencies and cheap lodging houses, which acted as fronts for brothels. Living on a meager salary herself, she frequently had to pawn her watch to pay her bills. But she interviewed girls who made even less than her, surviving on $6 a week doing factory work. They lived on bread and bananas and lived in rented rooms. They often relied on cash gifts and dinners from predatory men in order to make ends meet, and many were already just a few steps from prostitution. These encounters with the seamy and dangerous world of pimps and criminals who preyed upon the defenseless made it clear to Frances that she needed to continue her education in order to bring about real change and improvement in people's lives. She enrolled in courses in sociology and economics at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, with the progressive economist Simon N. Patten. Patten was impressed with her intelligence and aptitude and suggested that she continue her studies. In 1908, he helped her arrange a fellowship at Columbia University, investigating childhood malnutrition among school children in New York's Hell's Kitchen. She enrolled at Columbia as a master's degree candidate in sociology and economics. Her research project, entitled A Study of Malnutrition in 107 Children from Public School 51, became her master's thesis. In 1910, fulfilling an objective she set for herself at her college graduation 8 years before, Frances Perkins became executive secretary of the New York City Consumer League, working directly with Florence Kelley, the woman whose speech at Mount Holyoke had set the course of her career. Her work focused on the need for sanitary regulations for bakeries, fire protection for factories, and legislation to limit the working hours for women and children in factories to 54 hours per week. Much of her work was in Albany, in the halls and committee rooms of the state capitol. There, with the guidance and counsel of Assemblyman Al Smith, Senator Robert Wagner, and newfound Tammany Hall allies, Frances Perkins learned the skills of an effective lobbyist for labor and social reforms. On March 25, 1911, Frances Perkins was having tea with friends in New York City's Washington Square when the group heard fire engines. Running to the scene of a fire, she witnessed in horror as workers, mostly young women, jumped from the 8th and 9th floors of the factory building to their deaths on the street below. In all, 146 people, mostly young immigrant girls, died as flames engulfed the upper 3 stories of the building. The fire exits had been locked to prevent unsanctioned breaks, trapping workers inside on overcrowded and cluttered factory floors. The fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, she later proclaimed, the day the New Deal was born. She said of the incident that it, quote, struck at the pit of my stomach. I felt I must sear it not only on my mind, but on my heart as a never to be forgotten reminder of why I had to spend my life fighting conditions that could permit such a tragedy. And just a note that we just observed the anniversary of that terrible fire a few days ago. In response to the fire, a Citizens Committee on Safety was established to recommend practices to prevent a further tragedy in the city's factories. At the suggestion of Theodore Roosevelt, Frances Perkins was hired as the group's executive secretary. One of the committee's first actions was to seek a state commission to investigate and make legislative recommendations. The Factory Investigating Commission's mandate was much broader than originally contemplated, to study not only fire safety, but other threats to the health and well-being of industrial workers and the impact of those threats upon families. And you'll see her in this, long coat that she would wear on these factory investigations. Frances Perkins, by that time a recognized expert in the field of worker health and safety, served as expert witness, investigator, and guide, leading legislators on inspections of the state's factories and work sites to view firsthand the dangers of unregulated industrialism. The Commission's work resulted in the most comprehensive set of laws governing workplace health and safety in the nation that became a model for states beyond New York and for the federal government. Reflecting on her years as lobbyist, investigator, and researcher, Frances Perkins later said, quote, "The extent to which this legislation in New York marked a change in American political attitudes and policies towards social responsibility can scarcely be overrated. It was, I am convinced, a turning point." During this time, Frances was also active in the women's suffrage movement, participating in protests, marches, and street corner speeches. She was skilled at diffusing tense situations, often using her gentle humor to win over a crowd. The leadership and public speaking skills that she gained in this effort was also to serve her in the future. Sometime in 1910, Frances Perkins met the young and eminently eligible Paul Caldwell Wilson. From a wealthy and privileged family in Chicago, he and Frances had friends and connections in common. They married in September of 1913 in a small wedding in the city. Wilson was up and coming, a graduate of the University of Chicago, working as a key aide and personal secretary to New York City Mayor John Mitchell. Although in private life and on her passport, Frances took her husband's name, in her public life, she continued to be known as Miss Frances Perkins, as this was the name under which she had established her career. Their daughter, Susanna Perkins Wilson, was born in 1915, after Frances's first pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage. Although Susanna's long-awaited arrival brought joy to the couple, after only a few years, their marriage was troubled. Paul drank heavily and he gambled. His moods swung between depression and rash, erratic behavior. This pattern was the marker of a mental health condition that is known today as bipolar disorder, but it was not understood at the time. John Mitchell's term as mayor ended in disgrace, and Paul found himself without a job at the end of 1917. He made a number of reckless business investments, which resulted in the total loss of his inheritance and the family's financial security. Frances would become the sole breadwinner for the family, supporting not only her daughter's upbringing and education, but also her husband's medical care and treatment for the rest of his life. The gubernatorial election of 1918 was the first in which women in New York State had the right to vote. Frances Perkins had campaigned hard to capture the women's vote for Al Smith, her friend and ally for the prior 6 years in Albany. Shortly after his election as governor, Smith appointed her to a vacant seat on the New York State Industrial Commission. She was the first woman to be appointed to an administrative position in New York State government, and with an annual salary of $8,000, the highest paid woman ever to hold public office. Smith's goal was to weed out incompetence and corruption in the state labor department so that Frances and the State Industrial Commission could enforce the laws brought about by the Factory Investigating Commission. For Smith's 4 terms as governor, Frances Perkins served as his closest labor advisor, working with him to build on the legislative accomplishments of the prior decade. In his final term, he appointed her to chair the Industrial Commission. In the election of 1928, Smith lost his bid to become the nation's president, and New York elected a new governor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt asked Frances Perkins to become the state's industrial commissioner with oversight responsibilities for the entire labor department. In accepting the position, Frances said, quote, "I promise to use what brains I have to meet problems with intelligence and courage. I promise that I will be candid about what I know. I promise to all of you who have the right to know the whole truth so far as I can speak it." And you see her here with her daughter, Susanna, following her swearing in on January 14, 1929. Soon, Frances became the most prominent state labor official in the nation, as she and Roosevelt searched for new ways to deal with rising unemployment. Quote, "We have awakened with a shock to the frightful injustice of economic conditions which will allow men and women who are willing to work to suffer the distress of hunger and cold and humiliating dependence. We have determined to find out what makes involuntary employment," she said. Boldly, Perkins challenged the Hoover administration's prediction in January of 1930 that employment was on the rise and recovery from the Depression was in sight. Angry at what she considered a heartless deception, she called a press conference and announced that Hoover had been wrong. Figures from the New York Bureau of Labor Statistics showed a steady decline in employment, with that January's unemployment figures slated to be the worst in 16 years. Her confrontation with the White House made front-page news throughout the country. As the Hoover administration continued to make reassuring statements about the economy, she countered with statistical evidence of growing unemployment. It is cruel and irresponsible to issue misleading statements of improvement in unemployment at a time when the unemployed are reaching the ends of their resources, she said. From her position in New York State, Frances Perkins worked with representatives of labor and industry to explore long-range programs to increase employment. She helped organize a conference on unemployment of the 7 industrial states of the Northeast. She reorganized and expanded the state's employment agencies. But increasingly, her focus was on devising a program of unemployment insurance. With her encouragement, Roosevelt became the first public official in the country to commit himself to unemployment insurance, and in 1930, he sent Perkins to England to study the British system. In October, she returned armed with recommendations for an American version of that program. With the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt as President of the United States of America in 1932, Frances Perkins' years in public service in New York were over. Soon, however, the policies and programs that she had advanced for the state of New York were about to be tested for all the nation. Roosevelt asked her to go to Washington as his Secretary of Labor, a position that was both enticing and repellent. Enticing for the scope of opportunity it gave to make the meaningful changes she had worked for all her life. Repellent for the personal sacrifices it would require of her and her family. Perkins and Roosevelt met at his house on East 65th Street in New York City one chilly February night in 1933, and she went over her list of demands for his administration. A 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and health insurance. Roosevelt agreed to back her, and Perkins went home to think about it. She visited her husband, then a patient in a sanatorium, to ask his opinion. His main concern was the appointment's effect on himself and their teenage daughter. Frances offered to come home to New York every weekend to visit, a promise she fulfilled throughout her years in Washington. Even with Paul's blessing, however, Frances struggled with her acceptance, aware that she could open herself and her complicated family situation to public scrutiny, as well as receiving criticism for being a woman in a man's job. But she remembered her wise grandmother, Cynthia, who told her that whenever a door opened to you, you had no choice but to walk through it. The next day, she called Roosevelt to accept the position. And here you can see her letter of appointment. I hope you can read it on the screen, which was unusual enough to have a typewritten note at the bottom by Edwin Halsey, the Secretary of the Senate, noting that this was the first instance of a woman being appointed to the cabinet. And here is a Time magazine cover featuring Miss Perkins as Secretary of Labor from August 14th, 1933. From her earliest days in the Roosevelt cabinet, and here's the cabinet, you can see Perkins in the upper right corner wearing her hat. Frances Perkins was a forceful advocate for massive public works programs to bring the nation's unemployed back to work. Within a month of Roosevelt's inauguration, Congress enacted legislation establishing the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, which Roosevelt asked Perkins to implement. Roosevelt also asked her to present a plan for an emergency relief program, and she delivered a young social worker from New York named Harry Hopkins, who had visited Frances in Washington with his own proposal. That proposal became embodied in the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which Hopkins led. Before Roosevelt presented his final 100 days legislation to the Congress, the National Industrial Recovery Act, Perkins convinced him to allocate $3.3 billion for public works from the monies appropriated. Serving as a member of the Special Board for Public Works, Perkins helped to ensure that money was spent on socially useful projects, schools, housing projects, post offices, as well as infrastructure projects such as roads, highways, and bridges. And this photo you see here shows Perkins on a visit to the building site of the Golden Gate Bridge. Public works and construction employed as many as 1.5 to 2 million people in 1934. In particular through the efforts of the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I think there's maybe one more of these photos. In 1934, Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins to head a committee on economic security, where she forged the blueprint of legislation finally enacted as the Social Security Act. And signed into law by the president on August 14, 1935, as you can see here, the act included a system of old age pensions, unemployment compensation, workers' compensation, and aid to the needy and disabled. You'll notice in photos and a newsreel from this event that Miss Perkins appears anxious and somewhat impatient, submitting to the photo opportunity for what she considered her greatest achievement, but also eager to be somewhere else. This is because she had just received a call that her husband Paul had gone missing in New York, and immediately after the signing, she would run for the train station to head home and help look for him. In 1938, Congress enacted the Fair Labor Standards Act. Originally drafted in 1932 by Senator Hugo Black, a revised version was crafted with the support of Perkins and others in the Department of Labor. It established the right to a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, overtime pay, and a ban on the employment of minors in what was described as, quote, oppressive child labor. And just to note that the Fair Labor Standards Act is still the legislation that our child labor laws is based upon today. In 1944, a piece portraying Frances Perkins in Collier's magazine described her accomplishments over the previous 12 years as, quote, not so much the Roosevelt New Deal as the Perkins New Deal. At the time of Roosevelt's death in 1945, Frances Perkins was the longest serving labor secretary and one of only 2 cabinet secretaries to serve the entire length of the Roosevelt presidency. Theirs was a complex and productive partnership characterized by a deep and mutual respect and understanding. In the preamble to her book, The Roosevelt I Knew, that Perkins published in 1946, she said of him, quote, Franklin Roosevelt was not a simple man. That quality of simplicity which we delight to think marks the great and noble was not his. He was the most complicated human being I ever knew. She had accomplished all but one of the items on the agenda she had presented to the newly elected president in February of 1933, universal access to health care, obviously something we still struggle with. Before leaving the Department of Labor in June of 1945, Frances Perkins stood in the department's auditorium, and while a full orchestra played, she shook the hands and personally thanked every one of the department's 1,800 employees. The following evening, she was honored at the Mayflower Hotel. The months that followed were busy as she began writing The Roosevelt I Knew, a bestseller when it was published in 1946, and serving as head of the American delegation to the International Labor Organization in Paris. I believe that's this photo that we see right here. The following year, President Truman appointed her to the United States Civil Service Commission, a position she held until 1953. She then began a new career of teaching, writing, and public lectures, ultimately serving until her death as a lecturer at Cornell University's New School of Industrial Relations. And here are a few photos of her from Cornell. Frances Perkins suffered a stroke and died at Midtown Hospital in New York City on May 14, 1965, at the age of 85. She's buried alongside her husband, Paul Wilson, in the Glidden Cemetery on River Road in Newcastle, Maine, a short distance from the brick house, the place she always considered her home. I'm just going to stop sharing there. And just to, that's the end of the lecture part of the presentation, but just also to share a little bit of information about the Frances Perkins Center. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we acquired the family homestead in 2020, and it has not been open since then because, first of all, the pandemic, but then also some preservation work that had to take place at the site. So that's been in the works, and this June will be the first time the homestead will be open to visitors. And we have long-term goals to build an education center right next to the homestead. That's probably a few years down the line, but if you are able to come up to Midcoast Maine this summer, please call and make an appointment. We would love to welcome you to the homestead. And we also have the exhibit center on Main Street of Damariscotta, which features a similar display to what you have in the room behind you there, but it's a bit more expansive. So I'm going to end there, and just again, thank you so much for having us, having me, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
There we go. For any friends that are virtually, know that you are more than welcome to unmute and share your question or drop them in the chat if you have any. I don't know if anybody in the room has any questions. Fair enough. I'm curious. Obviously, knowing all of the things that she created are still like the foundations of what we run with today. What do you think she would push further and change now?
I think that healthcare was something that she tried to make happen. That was one of the pieces of her list for FDR, and it's the one thing that just couldn't be agreed upon and didn't happen in the 1930s, and it still hasn't happened. And I think that healthcare, universal healthcare or healthcare reform is still a huge impact on people's lives. And I think that she always strived to allow people to live better lives. And I think that these things that in some ways we have no, you look back at the 19th century, early 20th century, and the working conditions that people just sort of took for granted. That was, they didn't have any workers' compensation. They didn't have any safety. They didn't have specific hours. You had small children that were working in dangerous factories. Those things that was just accepted at that time. And so she was always looking for ways that people could live better lives. And so I think that she would definitely be working to make healthcare better today, because it continues to be a huge problem for people. So, hi, you have a question in the back, I see.
Yeah, I'm curious about her daughter, and whether she carried out any of her work, Francis's work.
That's a great question. And so her daughter, Susanna, they had a rather complex relationship. And Susanna, like her father, was bipolar. She was a very brilliant and talented woman, but also rather difficult. And she was very artistic. She was married twice, actually. Her first marriage ended because her husband was having an affair with somebody else's painter. I can't remember the name of the painter, but they were involved in the very sort of artsy New York scene. And then she married a man that had children from a previous marriage, and they ended up having one child together, Tomlin. And when Frances Perkins passed away, 1965, Susanna and her husband inherited the homestead, and they decided to just move from New York and move to Maine permanently. And so it's really thanks to her and to her family that we still have the homestead today, and that it was so preserved and cherished by that family. She was I think because at a very formative stage of her life, she was about 14 or 15 when her mother became Secretary of Labor and went to Washington and would just sort of come home to New York on the weekends. And I think she, it was a very difficult situation and she probably resented it. And she had a rather dramatic personality from all accounts. So yeah, the interesting relationship. You have a question?
That is because of her, you said.
I'm sorry?
Homestead.
I can't hear you, what you said.
In the homestead.
I'm sorry.
You said the daughter, she was in charge of and responsible for maintaining the homestead?
Yes, well, after she inherited it in 1965, they moved there full time. So she lived there and she and her husband took care of it, and she passed away, I think, in 2003. So, yeah. Yes, you had a question?
I just want to add that I was really impressed that she had enough courage. I'm not surprised, but I'm happy that she could say these unemployment records are wrong, that the White House is putting out. I like that. That's so cool. It's just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
She liked to tell it how it was. She was not somebody that, allowed embroidery of things. She believed in telling the truth. And as she said in her acceptance, when she was sworn in as Labor Secretary of New York State, she said, I will tell you the truth. And I think that's really how she lived her life. So.
Do we have any knowledge of the views of her at the time? Obviously, she was respected enough amongst the white men around her, which is huge for the time. What did the public think of her?
That's a great question. And I think because she was a person in a very public position, she had to be very careful of what she said and how she presented things. And as I mentioned, when she was considering FDR's offer, she was kind of torn about it because she knew that she had this husband that she was supporting, and that if the public knew about his situation, that they would be very critical of that. And so she had to protect her family. And there's a really wonderful article that actually I mentioned in the lecture that was printed in Collier's magazine in 1944. And it's a profile of her, and you really get a sense that how she kept herself away from the press. She was very distrustful of the press. She didn't like the fact that they could, manipulate what you said. And, nowadays, if you're a public figure, in office of some kind or another, you wouldn't be able to hide these things about your life, And so she really kept her personal life very private. And that was a means to protect her family. And then also she was, quite unique in that she was a woman in a role that there had never been a woman in that role before. And it's like she had to sort of create the structure for herself. And for instance, when she went to Washington, if you were a public official, there was this whole social, circles where you'd have parties and cocktail parties and invite people over and schmooze, and you'd have a nice house or apartment, and she was a woman, so she didn't have that setup. She lived for a while with a wealthy friend of hers who was a widow, and her friend kind of served that purpose for her in a way. Some people have suggested they had a warmer relationship than just friends, but there's no evidence to prove that one way or another. But I think that she was also a very spiritual person, and I heard you talking in the background when we came in about her being a saint, and she actually has been canonized, or I'm not sure exactly the term, in the Episcopal Church of the United States as a saint or a holy woman. She was very active in her faith, and she would go on monthly retreats, even while she was in Washington, to an Episcopal convent that was near the city. And it was her faith often kind of helped focus her and provide her with support when she didn't have it from the people that were around her. So it's a very long answer to your question.
Okay, more information the better, right?
Anything else? Come on, one more question.
Are you at the homestead?
I am not. I am actually in my living room in Wiscasset, Maine right now. But the homestead is not very far from here, and it is a really beautiful place. The house was built in 1837, and it's what we call big house, little house, back house, barn. It's literally, there's the brick house, and then it has all of these attached buildings. And so, as I mentioned, it was built in the 1830s, but the family had lived on that same property since the 1750s. And so further down on the property closer to the river, there are foundations and traces of other buildings that have, since fallen down. There's also the brickyard remnants that I mentioned. And the Damariscotta River is a really active, or it was, especially in those times, it was the way that people got around. You would go by boat, you would go up and down the rivers. It's a peninsula. It's also a saltwater river. It's tidal. And we now have a very active oyster farming community, so you can get Damariscotta River oysters. And before colonists came to Maine, the native peoples in the area would harvest oysters along the riverbank, and so it's possible that there were we haven't found traces of oyster middens on the property, but there are some others that are nearby that were there for hundreds and hundreds of years, just big piles of oyster shells building up. So it's a really unique kind of environment and climate, and very beautiful place.
Do you have a favorite little known fact that maybe doesn't necessarily make it into a presentation, but just you love that you know it?
I'll probably think of something in the middle of the night.
Sorry, put you on the spot.
Oh, well, so one thing that I think is kind of fun about Frances Perkins is she's often noted for always wearing this tricorn hats. She always wore the same style hat. And that's because when she was a young girl, her mother was, she and her mother didn't quite understand each other very well, but her mother was very into clothing and, you know, social things. And at one point when she was maybe a young teen, she took Frances aside and put a hat on her and said, "This is the style you should always wear because it suits your face and you can't wear other kinds of hats because they just won't look good." And so she took that to heart. And for the rest of her life, that's the kind of hat that she always wore. So,
Hey, for better or worse, right?
right. Always believe mom. So, oh, you have a question back there again. Hi.
Yeah, I wondered if you are going from campus to campus seeking interns to be Johnsons now that you're opening the home.
We thank you for that question. We actually do have summer interns. They're usually from, we have one from Mount Holyoke College, which is her alma mater. And the last few years, we've also had a student from Bates College nearby in Maine. And but we will be looking for other volunteers and people that can help us, you know, share the homestead with others. There's a lot of work ahead of us at this point. So, and Kathy.
I was wondering if you would share the, about the program at Mount Holyoke.
Oh, right.
Yes.
So we, for the month of April, this exhibition, this little traveling exhibit that you see in the room with you, will be on view at the campus library at Mount Holyoke. And there will be April 13th. Is that right, Kathy?
So I think it is the 13th.
Is it the 13th? A presentation by a woman named Jaris Hansen, who she's been a professor of communications at UMass. And she does a Chautauqua style portrayal performance as Frances Perkins. And so I would recommend looking that up. And there are a number of people who like to do these one-woman show historical portrayals, and Frances Perkins, I think just that she's such an interesting character and had such an amazing life. There are several of them. So Kathy knows of two of them that you can see performances in Massachusetts over the next few months. So, but that one will be at Mount Holyoke, I think April 13th. So
So I had one more, Emma.
yeah.
The fact that they named a street for Frances a year ago.
Yes. So I think it was 1 year ago. I'm not sure if it was exactly on the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, but around about, and maybe it was on the 25th. There was a block of New York's, I'm not sure which street it was, 46th Street?
Yeah.
Between 8th and 9th.
Yeah.
Was named Frances Perkins Place. So next time you go to New York City, go check that out. And it's very close to where she did her work for her master's thesis. So yeah, pretty big honor.
Very cool.
I think it took about 10 years to get that, didn't it? It took a long time.
Yeah, it was a big occasion. The mayor was there. I think the governor was the governor there, or somebody was representing her.
Well, the woman from Albany.
Kathy was actually there, so she should tell you about it.
Yeah, I actually was there, it was fascinating. The woman that has Francis's job in Albany was there.
Oh, wow.
Although I had it, the title's a little different. So she was, really very interesting. And there was a state senator that was there and a state rep for the community, that particular section of the city. So, yeah, I mean, they worked really hard with Tom and your grandson on getting that done.
Yeah, Tomlin was there, so.
Did she move to Newcastle, or where'd she go when she retired?
She never retired. She was still working at Cornell. And, although she made a really good salary throughout those years, you have to consider she was supporting her daughter and also this husband that had expensive medical bills throughout the rest of his life. And she never really had enough money to retire. She always wanted to retire and then go to Newcastle full time. But by the time she died, she was teaching at Cornell. She was actually living in a dormitory, and it was an honors dormitory called Telluride House. And at the time they offered for her to live there, it was all male. And then while she was living there, they voted to allow women to live there. And one of our board members, Christopher Bryseth, he has some great stories because he was actually a graduate student that lived in Telluride House when she was living there. So he was a young man at the time. And so he's the only person I know, aside from Tomlin Perkins Coggeshall, who actually met her and knew her. And he just thought the world of her. And he just describes her as a very charming person. She loved to be involved in all of the dorm meetings. She would give the boys love advice, and but by that point she was really very deaf. She couldn't hear very well anymore, and her eyesight was failing her. But Christopher also says that she kind of had the weight from her shoulders removed, because by that point her husband had passed away, so she didn't have that worry or burden anymore to worry about him. And she just was kind of like living her best life at that point. All of her meals were taken care of, and so yeah.
Sounds like at that stage she earned it, so.
Yeah. I think it sounds like she had a pretty fun last few years. She was, and she was actually in New York City, as I mentioned, when she passed away. She'd gone to see the ballet, and then she had a stroke, and so. And anyway.
I have another story you could tell.
What's that?
A story that Christopher told when Jimmy Hoffa came to Telluride House.
Right. I probably won't do justice to Christopher's story, but Jimmy Hoffa had been invited because they'd asked him to participate, I think, in a conference or something about labor relations. I can't remember the details, but he was so eager. He was just like, I really want to meet Miss Perkins. And she did not want to meet Jimmy Hoffa. She just didn't. And she's like, I'm not going. They're like, oh, he wants to meet you. Sorry, I'm not going to come. And then they had a reception in Telluride House in the dormitory. She went upstairs to her room. She said, I'm going to bed. I'm not coming. And someone was like, no, you have to go wake her up, have her come down. And someone went up and knocked on her door, and she's like, I'm not coming out. And so they finally convinced her, and she put some things on, got dressed and came back down and met Jimmy Hoffa. And he was just like, oh, I'm so admiring of all the things that you did as Secretary of Labor, and you really improved you know, all the unemployment, and she said very curtly, actually, it was World War II that brought an end to unemployment. And then she sort of turned around and went back on.
It was World War II that brought the end to unemployment.
Anyhow,
So humble.
she had a very, like, I think if you get a chance to read this book, The Woman Behind the New Deal, by Kirsten Downey, it's probably the most comprehensive biography of her, and it's really great reading. There are sections of it where it's just like, this should be a movie. I'm always thinking with the section where she was a young woman living in Philadelphia, working to prevent, you know, women from going into prostitution, and it's such an amazing story. She would have to like chase people with her umbrella, and, you know, publicly denounce people on the street, like, you're, you know, she was having the time of her life. It's a great story. So, and that was just, you know, when she was in her mid-20s. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, well, it's 8:06. Do we have any more questions or anything else?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we've
Well,
exhausted.
thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope that now you can share more about Frances Perkins with the world. And there is also a really great documentary called Summoned that was produced by PBS that came out a few years ago. So that's another thing you can seek out if you want to learn more about her. And then please be sure to visit our website for more programs and events coming up this year as we open the homestead. And come visit us. Come to Maine. It's beautiful.
And of course, anybody who's online and not here in person, this beautiful exhibit will be here the rest of the week. So come check it out. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.